thank you first of all to all the organizers for inviting me, but also for putting together this wonderful program. I'm looking forward to catching up on some things later. It's wonderful to be able to tell you a lot about work that is ongoing in my lab, work that I think will hopefully be very exciting when it's finished, but will also perhaps spark some interest today, make people have a little bit of a think. And the talk I want to give you is one that I think brings two of my research streams together. So namely that I've been working for about 15 years on social coordination, how we coordinate our bodies in time with one another. A good example might be the dancing seen here. And then more recently, a focus on how we also can feel connected through space by holding hands, for example. And feeling connected to others is a really important part, I think, of a happy and fulfilled life. Some people need to be connected to lots of people, some to fewer, but this connection seems really pivotal to well-being. And as I said, I think we have two main ways that we can see stretching across the ages, ways in which we've tried to maintain these connections with one another. One in space, and I think that the easiest way that this can come about is through touch. And there's good evidence that you and I, through touch, are co-located in space. Our brain can interpret that co-location through touch. And then the other way we can feel connected is through time, where if we connect and coordinate our actions together in a timed lock manner, this is good evidence for our system, for our brain, that we are together now. So what I want to tell you about today is how I'm exploring this idea of connectedness in these two ways by investigating the sensory basis of these social exchanges. And I see that there's somebody trying to come in. I don't know if I need to do that, but I assume not.
Oh, no, we'll take care of that. Don't worry.
Okay. So the problem that we have, and I hope that it was obvious in the painting I just showed you, is that social interactions are highly complex and not always positive. Whether trying to walk hand in hand down a crowded street or trying to understand what is meant by an unexpected touch, when we try to process and engage in these interactions, it can cause a challenge, even for the most well-adjusted person. And I think during COVID, we were all on high alert. And so these interactions were even more difficult for all of us. So today I'm going to try and zoom in on what I feel are the two main aspects of what makes interacting with others difficult. And that's namely uncertainty and unpredictability. Now, obviously, there are really clear cases where it is precisely these things that make your first date seem really tantalizing and exciting. You don't know who's going to make the first move. But I think it's when our tolerance threshold is passed, and we can all imagine a time, maybe during COVID, when we felt really uncomfortable as a result of not knowing how things would turn out. In autistic individuals, I think there's a good evidence for an established predisposition for an intolerance of uncertainty and either causal relationship with anxiety or some kind of interplay between the two. And moreover, a core symptom of ASD is a strong preference for predictability. So I think it's fair to assume that avoiding social interactions by those with autism may be due to their attempt to avoid both the unpredictable or the uncertain. But I would say that for these individuals, or indeed for ourselves during COVID, simply avoiding social interactions is not a long-term solution, with the effects we all felt during COVID so acutely often described in socially disconnected individuals like people with autism. Whether it's loneliness, depression, or self-harm, these are things we don't necessarily want to, these are things we want to avoid. So we can't just switch ourselves off from our social world. So we're all here together, I think, in this conference to explore a potential solution to this kind of problem. I think with the hope that virtual reality on the one hand allows us to create rich, multi-sensory environments that work as a proxy, or indeed a way to train individuals to better deal with social exchanges. Or I think, as Letizia and colleagues have so nicely phrased, foster social connections among the most disconnected individuals. And I really like that as a way of thinking what we're trying to do with virtual reality. So today I'm going to describe what I see as a mediating factor of efficacy of virtual social environments, namely co-presence. You're not going to be able to use this rich multisensory environment for social exchange if you don't actually feel that you are present or that you are present with others. And then by detailing 2 ongoing experiments, I'm going to try and highlight how these in particular can be used to probe the relative importance of those 2 factors I mentioned earlier, certainty and predictability, both for neurotypicals, but also those with ASD. So let's start by thinking a little bit about what I mean by co-presence. Obviously, this is a hotly debated area. I'm actually in transition, moving to a new institution where we're going to be focusing on the so-called tactile internet, where the term telepresence is being thrown around by my colleagues. And so I've been, in preparation for this talk, really trying to get a sense of whether people actually know what they mean by presence, co-presence, social presence, or indeed telepresence. And my answer to you is we don't know. But the things that I have come to seem pretty sure is that co-presence is something we all have a sense that we understand what it means. And we can probably best term it as the feeling of being there in that space together. And I'm pretty sure that if we all think back to a lonely time in our lives, it was that we didn't have that feeling of being there together. And this can be because we were too far away. We know that this feeling, whatever we want to call it, is often made easier. It's heightened by physical proximity. But we also know that it can be approximated or indeed imagined. There's some really nice data on loneliness where it seems that those people who are lonely are really actively trying to use their brain to imagine, to find a replacement for actual physical closeness. And indeed, when we're using a Zoom call to connect with loved ones far away or just thinking about them, we are trying to help ourselves to have that feeling of being there together. And it's also why when we use virtual reality or similar environments in which we have virtual versions of both ourselves and others, we can also feel it then. But what interests me as a neuroscientist who primarily works on how our brain deals with sensory information, what seems to be key is that the degree of this feeling of being there depends on the quality of the sensory input available and how it's processed in a top-down manner. And what we mean by that is that depending on our expectations, on what we've learned to expect from others, if that information is there, we feel good about it. We think, yeah, that is mom or dad. They smell this way, they seem this way. But if we have a virtual representation of that person or a really bad connection through Zoom, where you can't quite make up, what they look like or what they sound like, that feeling of co-presence is clearly going to be problematic. Now, one last point that I'd like to make is that there seems to be an additional criteria or another way in which we can boost co-presence. And that's when we jointly manipulate objects in shared space. Now, the reason I want to mention this is because I'm going to talk a little bit about affective touch later. And I'm just going to tell you this now, but I'll repeat it again later. I'm a mom of 5, and I know that sometimes you have to say things over and over again, both to sink into yourself, but to sink into those you're talking to. But the interesting thing I want to think about here, and I'll bring it up again later, is that the shared thing, that object that we might be sharing, might be the skin surface that is both being touched and the toucher is touching it and the touchee is being touched. That skin surface might also be considered as an object that is being manipulated, is being interacted with by both individuals. And that shared surface, that shared object might be a way to bind people together. I'm going to leave that thought with you, but we'll come back to it later. Because I want to say, before moving on to the experiments, a little bit more about what I think we need to think about when considering this idea of co-presence. Because I think there are two main factors that I'm trying to manipulate in my experiments that I'm going to be telling you about. The one is that I think that interactions with others are very rarely snapshots. Whether you're on a Zoom call or you're trying to navigate towards one another on a busy sidewalk, these things happen over time. I'm going to be talking about these dynamic interactions because it's indeed this moment-to-moment awareness of co-presence, as stated by Björk et al., that seems to be so pivotal to this feeling of being there together. That our brain can't just use one data point to feel there. They need to see the dynamic nature of that interaction to feel present. And I'm going to hopefully make the point that the experiments that we've been running try to both replicate that dynamic nature of the interaction, but also try to capture or understand how those interactions change over time. And then the second thing I want to say, again, reminding you that this comes from my bias of being really interested in how we do these things just based on the information coming in through our senses. And the 2 points I'd like to make is one, that our exchanges with individuals are just that, they're an exchange. I send you a message and you receive it, and then you send me a message back and I receive it. But that information that we send to each other might come in multiple forms. This information might be multi-sensory in nature. You may hear me speaking and see me speaking, as well as gesticulating probably far too much. But that co-presence will vary as a function of the availability of that multi-sensory information, which is why we want to create these rich virtual environments in which we can see each other and hear each other and maybe even touch each other. And then the second point that you'll see on your screen is the idea that the relevance and reliability of these social cues. Now that goes back to what we were saying before, this idea of expectations, of the way in which information is processed in a top-down manner. If we feel that that information is both relevant and reliable, we're more likely to use it to help us feel together. Let's zoom along and talk a little bit about some of the experiments that we've been doing. And I basically just want you to think about this in two halves. The first experiments I'm going to be telling you about are within a virtual environment in which people walk together, something we do every day. And then I'm just going to tell you now that we're also now making this environment into a place where people can dance together, which I'm very excited about, but it's really super preliminary. But if you're interested, we can definitely have a talk about that. But for now, I just want you to think about this virtual environment that you see in front of you, in which, whether you're in a concert hall, watching your favorite band, or you're just milling around, we often walk together. But what can make these interactions more or less difficult to deal with, we feel, relies on how predictable the information is, that sensory information we were just talking about, how predictable that information is that you are receiving from those around you. And this will make it easier or harder to coordinate with them. And then the second experiment that I want to tell you about is how we connect through touch. Remember, we can connect through time, that's on your left-hand side, and we can connect through touch, that's on your right-hand side. And then I'm going to show you some experiments we've been running where we modulate whether or not you both see, but also feel a physical stroke on your real body while being immersed in a virtual environment. And we modulate a person's experience of this affective touch in VR as a function of the certainty of the context. Who is touching me? Where are they touching me? And is this in a clinical context or in a more familial or a more neutral? So we're going to talk about this aspect of certainty and how it changes the way we perceive affective touch. And then I'm going to tell you about some of the measures we've been using, because I think that they go a long way to trying to capture this dynamic nature on the one hand, of these experiences with others. This is just an example of entropy, a measure of information flow between individuals, something we can capture in these experiments. Just a placeholder. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But also how we engage and maybe can use these as markers of presence or indeed co-presence, how we can use things like heart rate, galvanic skin response, how we can use these objective physiological measures to determine whether or not people were affected by these virtual touches that either were accompanied with a real physical stroke or not. So I'm going to try and help you to see how we are probing these virtual environments beyond just subjective questionnaires, which I also rely on heavily, because how we actually feel and describe how we feel is important, but I think they need to be bolstered by some other objective data, which adds just extra pieces to the puzzle. And we're going to focus, as I said, on that left-hand side on how we connect through others in time. And I'm going to tell you about a pretty great book that if you haven't read, I can highly recommend it. It's called Keeping Together in Time. And the only thing I'm going to tell you about it today is what I think answers the question of why we connect with others, why we coordinate with others. It's really hard. Now, these chappies, either on the book cover or indeed behind, are showing just how good we are at coordinating with other people. But it's really not easy, even if you don't like being in large groups. Just the sensory motor aspect of hearing a beat and coordinating your body in time with a group of others is really challenging to the system. So my question is, why do we do it? And the reason provided by William McNeill is a term he calls muscular bonding. Now, you may be already thinking what that might mean. I'm going to tell you. The idea is that we literally, through the process of aligning our bodies in time with another, we provide a scaffold to align ourselves with others at other levels, emotional, cognitive. By doing the same thing at the same time, we start to put ourselves in other people's shoes. We start to share ideas and goals. And as a result, we see a so-called attunement across individuals. He calls it muscular bonding, and I think it's a really nice term. And it's the answer we have to the question, why, despite it being so difficult, we coordinate with others. But the second question I want to ask is, how do we do this? And I think that this is really important because it'll explain to us why it sometimes doesn't work out. And I'm going to cite a recent paper that I wrote with Guillaume Dumas on this idea of reciprocal alignment, where I try to get on the same page as somebody else. And I think that that's a nice way of describing this way of give and take, where I send a message to you and you receive it, and you send a message to me and I receive it. But in receiving the information, I'd maybe change the way I'm behaving. You're sending me the message that you're slowing down as we walk together, holding hands down the street. I feel it maybe because we're holding hands and I feel you pulling back a little bit, or you tell me so I hear it, or I notice it through my visual system. These pieces of multi-sensory information help me to understand that maybe I need to change the way I'm behaving. And hopefully, in a really good dynamic, we're mutually adapting, maybe not at the same rate, maybe not to the same amount, but there's this idea of mutual adaptation. And that this depends pivotably on me having a sense of self, having a sense of the other, and processing those two streams of information. Now, what makes that difficult is that it's fairly easy to predict self-information. I have really good access to that. But sometimes if somebody's acting a little bit, is a little bit volatile, is not acting the way you expect them to, or they keep changing their mind, or if they're being unpredictable, makes it pretty hard to do this mutual alignment, mutual adaptation. I've put two little excerpts of papers because I just want to point out two things. The one is a really great paper from the 70s by Trevathan, who is talking about this interpersonal timing matching between caregiver and infant. And the two little things I want to say is that she says that through this matching, this reciprocal alignment I've been talking about, a structure of being with another person is organized. I'm hoping that that's sounding a lot like co-presence. I'd highly recommend reading that paper. The paper on the right is a paper I wrote together with Isabel Jobek's lab quite a while ago now, in which they used one of our sensory motor coordination tasks where we get people to finger tap with a virtual partner, where they get to use this dynamic exchange of information to mutually adapt to one another and try to synchronize over time. And they use this as an intervention, they use this as a marker of how beneficial a dance or imitation intervention was with both a set of healthy controls and adults with autism spectrum disorder. Why I'm mentioning this is that I'm going to show you some data about it, but in case you're interested, I wanted the paper to be up there. There we go. So I've told you that, I've hinted at the fact that I've been doing this for a while, and in the paper I just told you by Kuhn et al. With the ASD adults, we were doing this really silly finger tapping experiment. We did it because it's a very easy one to run in the lab. And more importantly, it's kind of cool that just tapping your finger with someone, or indeed just a pacing signal, can help you feel this being together. But what I wanted to show you about today is how we've extrapolated from that dyadic, this two-person scenario, into a group scenario. Because I think it's there that these factors of uncertainty and unpredictability become really important. So I'm going to tell you about a group walking task that we've been doing, where the participant will hear a pacing signal, and then they have to walk in time with it. But at the same time, they also hear the footstep sounds of those around them. Or indeed, in the virtual reality scenario, they both see them and hear them. These groups of people, these groups of avatars walking around them. So the three things I want to say is, one is that their explicit task is to walk with the pacing signal. But there's also this implicit task that they're supposed to also bear in mind those around them, and they'll probably try to accommodate and coordinate with those around them. The other is that from this data, we can extract out time course onsets. So where my footstep sounds start, where the pacing signal sounds start, where the other's footsteps start. And from these, we can determine who is synchronizing with who is coupling with whom. And we can also see how that changes over time and how they're coordinating. So I think it's a pretty powerful experiment. I'm going to just show you a couple of videos of what it looks like so that you can have that in the background while I tell you a few other points about the task. So the one is that the scenario is one in which you're in this big concert hall that's shown on the right-hand side, where she's just getting into her body or into his body. And that's you'll see now that you're using the point of view of the participant. They can look around and see who is walking with them. And because it's a virtual environment, we can control the number of people around them, the kind of people around them, how close they are, how they're arranged. So we can really manipulate that group setting. And as a result, we can try and manipulate how well people do at the explicit task, coordinating with that pacing signal, but also how they then are influenced by the footstep sounds of those around them. And then we do some measurements, of course. We take those timing onsets. So we can look at objective measures of coordination, temporal coordination. We can look at engagement and looking behavior, who's coupling to whom just by looking at them. And then we can also look at some of the subjective measures, how they feel about the interaction through affiliation ratings, cooperation ratings, even agency ratings. I'm just going to tell you that what we find is that when people have a strong sense of self in these scenarios, they coordinate better. So this idea that when we are co-present, that there's some kind of merging of self and other, our data seems to show that there still has to be a little bit of me in that we for me to coordinate my actions properly. And because I am wary of the time and I want to show you everything, I just want to tell you that from this data, we can do some pretty cool things. Now, the first graph on your screen at the top is actually from that data that we collected with Isabel Jobek's group in Berlin. And this is actually unpublished data where we show that as a function of how adaptive the people are around you, neurotypicals in the red curve and ASD individuals show a very different pattern of where they feel comfortable, where their comfort zone is. And we know from other data that those neurotypical individuals are more likely to like a moderate degree of give and take. We like somebody who adapts a little bit to us, but not too much. And that's why we see this parabolic function. But in the ASD adults, we see that this linear function is such that where they feel most comfortable is where they know exactly how the pacing signal is going to behave, how that partner is going to behave, where they are very predictable and their adaptivity is actually 0. And what we want to do with our virtual reality data now is testing both neurotypicals and ASD individuals is see whether we can replicate these curves by changing how adaptive the virtual partners are around them. The other thing that we're busy doing is looking at transfer entropy. So information exchange between individuals using their time course data to see whether or not information is indeed flowing to all people around you or just one particular individual. So we can use this dynamic data in ways to better understand the dynamics of social exchanges in VR. Now I'm going to move to the shorter second experimental part of my talk where I'll tell you about how we can connect through touch in a virtual environment. And the two things I want to tell you is one, that context is key. I'm sure you've heard this in many other ways, but for touch, it's key because who touches us, where they touch us, and why they touch us can completely determine whether or not we find a gentle stroke on the shoulder pleasant or unpleasant. And there's a lot of data to go into if you want to discuss that a bit more, but context is key. And we're going to manipulate context in this experiment I'm going to tell you about by thinking a little bit about how a clinical context and a neutral context can change whether or not we feel more certain about the touch that we experience, and as a result, whether it'll be more or less pleasant. Some of the questions that you may want to think about separately is whether this is just a factor of familiarity. If it's an unknown doctor versus a known doctor, will it look very similar to touch experienced by a family member, a familiar loved one? And then something that I'm working a lot on at the moment is whether certainty is heightened or indeed related to two other factors of reciprocity and trust. Do I trust you because I'm more certain about how you're going to behave? Will I trust you more if we can both send and receive information? I can touch you and you can touch me. And through that process, do I become more certain of how things will evolve in that more dynamic conceptualization of interactions with others? So just very quickly, I want to show you what we've done is we've created these two contexts in which people can be stroked by an avatar standing next to the person who is seated. There's the avatar. In one context, the neutral context, there are no clues as to where you might be. And indeed, the instructions are such that you are just in a virtual environment. In the second, you're in a physiotherapist's room and you have lots of visual cues to tell you so and instructions beforehand that you're about to have a physiotherapist intervene on a muscular problem that you have. We then also manipulate whether or not they get a physical stroke by the experimenter at the same time as seeing a stroke in the virtual world. And we want to see whether both the factor of context, so how certain you are about what might happen, versus whether or not you get physically stroked at the same time, whether these two things will have an effect on both how you feel, but also measures of engagement and arousal. And I'm just going to rush through because I don't want to be too late. And what we can see in our data is a few things. First of all, we know that the pleasantness ratings are very much affected by having the physical stroke. They find it more pleasant to be stroked while also being present in that virtual realm. But what I want to focus on is the fact that Carrie and colleagues have very recently provided some nice new evidence bolstering the idea that effective touch can enhance subjective embodiment. But their data says that it's in a body part specific manner. Now, our data shows that touch in the virtual environment is rated as more vivid generally, and that's what you see on the left-hand side, and that increasing vividness correlates with greater general embodiment. Now, some of the open questions that this prompts me to think about is, from a multi-sensory perspective, how close does that physical stroking from the experimenter have to be in terms of location and timing to not break or jar with the virtual world experience? We're thinking about that way in which top-down sensory information is processed. That's what that is linked to. And secondly, does vividness predict embodiment, or does greater embodiment result in the experience being felt as more real? These are questions I'm going to leave you to think about yourself. Perhaps more importantly, though, once having established how effective touch modulates a sense of self, this embodiment and the vividness of the experience, to me, what we're now looking at is objective markers of co-presence to see whether, based on some of the criteria I talked about at the beginning of this talk, interacting with a shared object, in this case, the skin surface, having top-down mediated expectations that are fulfilled, or the fact that we're providing pretty salient social cues, where this modulates the degree of feeling of being there together. And that's what I want to show you here, which is that from previous work that I've done with real physical touch, we can look at markers of engagement and what we think could be then used as a proxy for presence in the form of heart rate and indeed attention to the stroke or indeed to the avatar. And we're busy processing that data now. So just to summarize, I want to tell you what I've told you today, because it's really useful for myself to make sure I've covered it all. One is that I've tried to tell you a little bit about how I feel the idea of co-presence, at least in the way that we formulated it together today, depends on sensory exchange. And that the sensory exchange might be both multisensory, but also change dynamically over time. And that through virtual reality, we can create these proxies in the virtual realm. And then through two different types of experiments, I've tried to show you that we can feel together in time, but that it's easier when it's more predictable. And that we can feel together through touch, but it usually feels better when it's more certain. And I've tried to show you how we can use novel paradigms and also new approaches, new computational approaches, new modeling approaches, and more objective data to bring these pieces of the puzzle together to better understand why and how we can use virtual reality to facilitate engagement in those who feel disconnected. I just want to thank you for your time, again, to the organizers and to these people who have made this work possible. Thank you.